I have the pleasure of leading an organization called Propellus. So I want to provide a little bit of context about what we do and then talk about some volunteerism. But first, by show of hands, how many people have volunteered in the last year? Yeah. So I don't need to spend any time on how great it feels to volunteer. We're going to talk about it. I want to talk about it a little bit more, not from the technical side, but how actually we are the soul of this city. You are it, it is you. Brian talked about the mountaintops. When we think about system change, we can really think about it from research by Dr. Francis Wesley out of Waterloo as institutional change, organizational change, network change, and individual change. So what Jay and Danny have been talking about really falls at that individual level and then up to that network level because groups of people start working together to affect change. They build networks. And what Brian was talking about was that institutional change, policy, taxation, corporate structures, all of those sorts of things. And where we come from Propellus is we really come at it from the organizational level. One of the wonderful things that this city created in 1955, the Junior League created an organization that became Volunteer Calgary, and it was really the central bureau for volunteerism. You could call and they would connect you to a volunteer opportunity. And we have morphed over 60 years and most recently have changed into become Propellus. And part of that is that we don't need a single organization dedicated. We're not the owners of volunteerism in this community. You are. And part of that is driven by the research. Does anyone know the number one reason why people volunteer? Someone asked. Absolutely. Notwithstanding all the databases, all the technology that you could use to find an opportunity, people volunteer because they were asked. You are more likely to be asked if you know more people. The more people you know, or the amount of people you know, is called your social capital. How much social capital do you have? And so this is why people like Danny end up volunteering for everything. Because they're like, hey, she volunteers a lot and we know she knows how to do that and she's really good and we know she's like keen to do those sorts of things. So let's ask her. She'd be great, right? And let's ask Jay because we know he's like leads organizations. He's totally committed to doing this kind of, we'll ask him. So this is what happens, right? Let's start to think about the people who have less social capital. People have language barriers, people have cultural barriers, people who are new to the city don't have friend or social network, right? And so how do we start to build social capital? Volunteering is actually a way to build social capital. People generally or have historically thought of volunteerism as a altruistic thing that you give and then it feels good to give and so that's the feedback loop, right? But in fact, it's research tells us, and it's totally appropriate and fine, to recognize that volunteering is a two-way street. You give and you get. So not only are you getting social capital and building your network and connection to your community, you're actually building human capital. You're actually building the skills and abilities that you can use to make a living for you and for your family. We see many volunteers who are actually volunteering in between jobs so that they can go to their next employer to say, I was active, I was busy, I was developing new skills, I was right when I had this time of this, maybe it was an unexpected transition. And we also have corporations who, when they are reducing their workforces, a great organization that merged into TransCanada, Nova, they had a whole placement program. That was part of their restructuring plan. And they paid the salaries of people to go into work in the nonprofit and voluntary sector. So volunteerism, you are all volunteers. I don't need to tell you what that experience is like, but what I want to focus on is the change and the difference that is made by your action in community. And when we look at a system level, and not to bring us down, but when we look at a community like Ferguson, Missouri, there are a lot of problems. That has to do with economy, it has to do with culture and race, it also has to do with urban design, it has to, all of these systems intersect. What do you think the likelihood are that people would destroy community infrastructure that they painted and built themselves? That they know the person who runs the store in their neighborhood in Inglewood, right? This is the actual building of the social fabric that becomes what a city is. It is we and we are it. And so you're in this constant feedback loop when you're engaging in community. And what I think Three Things does so brilliantly is that it is not a campaign, it's not a program, it's a movement, and we choose. And at the end of the day, we are the volunteer capital of Canada. We exceed the rest of the country in our rates of volunteerism. We choose every day to be actively engaged. And we have leadership in this city. I'm not picking a political side and talking about actions that actually are validated by research. They're paying attention to urban design. How do we make sure that we're building communities that don't lead to social and economic problems? How are we creating mixed use, changing density levels, reducing reliance on transportation, which is a cost that some people can't bear? Right? All of these pieces play together to create a city. They all work together to create a city, and it's up to us how we choose to make that city great. That's why it matters if you vote. It's why it matters if you participate as a volunteer. I loved Bailey in the Dover project. Is Bailey here? No. Because this is the thing that I find that she stumbled upon that, right? She didn't know what was going to happen to her when she was participating, but what she clearly said to all of us was, I'm a part of something now. And so it's a creation of identity, it's a creation of place and belonging. And all of those are words that we would probably use to describe a community. So volunteering isn't just a nice to do. It is fundamental. It is a need to do to build a civil society, the likes that we have here. And it can be transformative. We changed the way the Olympic movement engaged volunteers in the delivery of games. We did that in 1988. And all the Olympic Games that have followed since have used that model. And it's been challenging in cultures where there's less volunteerism, right? That's been more challenging. So what I would say is that every time you choose to volunteer, you are doing an act of building community. And there's a difference between formal and informal volunteering. Informal volunteering is those things that aren't related to an official or organization. Maybe you shovel your neighbor's walk, part of the Snow Angels kind of program. Those sorts of things that you do entirely just, you run an errand for a friend who's in the hospital. Those are the sorts of things that are informal volunteering. And lots of times, the research has to be really careful when it looks at this, because people don't actually often recognize that that is in fact volunteering. They generally recognize it as being a decent human being, right? I took a meal to a sick friend, right? But you still voluntarily did that action. There's no compensation for that other than what you're building with that person. One of our former leaders, Martha Parker, in resisting the temptation to put an economic value around volunteering, said to me one day, "What is the economic value of me holding your hand while you die?" Right? We can use an economic value to volunteerism. We can talk about what it would cost an organization to have to staff positions. An organization like the Distress Center. The front line of emergency mental health care in this city is delivered by volunteers. Right? The Distress Center, an amazing organization. If they can tell you how much it would cost them if they had to have the staff, to pay staff to do that, versus engaging skills-based volunteers, or engaging volunteers that they train and skill up, if you will. So that can provide an important measure of the value of volunteerism, but in fact doesn't actually address the whole picture, because there's a part that is not economically quantifiable. And I totally agree with Brian. When I sit in the room with senior executives from the business community, they have no idea that we're 8% of the GDP, that we're 14% of the population. Those are people who work on multi-billion-dollar projects, and when they hear those numbers, they start to perk up, and they see things a little bit differently. But for all of that, the soul of this city is wrapped up into the relationships that we build with each other. It's built in our human capital and in our social capital. So I thank you all for being amazing volunteers in the community. Encourage you to continue to do that and to participate in the Three Things movement, and to give through tools like GoodPin or other ways in which philanthropy works for you. It's really what the soul of the city is about. Thank you so much.